koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the Auckland Unitarian Church. A special welcome to visitors. This is a place that has been home to people like us for 116 years. Unlike many churches, we don't have a creed. Instead, we have shared principles which are printed up on the wall there, such as the inherent worth of every person, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Today we'll be looking at another of our principles, the belief in a society of peace, liberty and justice for all. And I especially ask you the question, does New Zealand really believe in liberty with such a high proportion of people in our jails? Well, those are the goals that we are here to share, and we hope that if you're visitors, you also will share some of your goals with us. And we invite you to share a cup of tea or coffee with us after the service. Welcome. The opening words that I've chosen for today are from Muhammad Ali. He compares jails with slavery. He himself had just been sentenced to jail for refusing to fight in Vietnam. And he wrote this: "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters, of darker people the world over. This is the day when such evils must come to an end. I have been warned that to take such a stand would cost me millions of dollars, but I have said it once and I will say it again, the real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom and equality. If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my people, they wouldn't have to draft me, I'd join tomorrow. I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs, so I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. I light this candle as a symbol of the flame of inspiration that has been passed on to us and that we share with one another. Well, the question I've been studying for the last few weeks is, does New Zealand put too many people into jail? Our covenant includes the suggestion that there is something wrong with jail because it asserts the goal of world community with peace, liberty and justice for all. But there is a conflict of interest there. If there's justice for all, doesn't that mean that some people are going to have to be punished to give justice to other people whom they have harmed? And doesn't punishment of people who've done harm to others have to have some bottom line? And isn't the bottom line to punish them by jail? But if some people have to go to jail, then that means there cannot be liberty for all. I think that is a serious dilemma, but I think the first step is clear, to ask, does the harm of punishment outweigh the good it is supposed to cause? And so I don't pretend to answer the question of how can we get liberty and justice for all, but I can see many ways in which we can approach that more closely. And I thank our government for raising that question. Not whether we should have prisons, but do we have too many people in them? And I give the first word of my sermon to Judge Stephen Koss, who is President of the Court of Appeal, who spoke to the Legal Research Foundation a month or two ago and was quoted by the Herald on August 29. I'd like to run with you his conclusions. He says that prisons are good places for bad people. They are places in which dangerous people should be kept. But there are many kinds of people that they are not good for. Firstly, they are not good for the mentally unwell, and these people make up 60% of those who are sentenced to prison. So if there is some more appropriate treatment of people who are convicted of crime yet are mentally unwell, our prison population would go down 60%. He also says they are not good for people who've got good prospects of being rehabilitated. He doesn't put a number on these people, but he said there are many Christians who pose, many criminals who pose no danger to society, and they should spend as little time in prison as necessary to denounce their offending. He said he had seen no evidence that longer sentences are a deterrent, either to the people who commit crime or to the rest of the public. He said the best deterrence is the prospect of getting caught, rather than the actual punishment that follows. And that suggests then that another part of the answer must be improving the effectiveness of the police. Put more money, appoint more prison officers and fewer wardens. But he said keeping offenders off the street, even though it works in the short term, does not work in the long term. He said eventually, when those people have been released, they will be more inclined to reoffend than they were when they started, because prisons teach crime and they disable prisoners from going straight. Often it's said that people need to be in prison to make society safer. But Judge Cost says we do not need to make society safer in New Zealand because it is safe enough already. It is an exceptionally safe society, second only to Iceland. In particular, he says we need more options to prison, more alternatives. And I think that is probably the most helpful part of his article. Among those options, he says, we need to have more use of home detention. At present, home detentions have an arbitrary cut-off point of 2 years for people who don't pose a risk and have somewhere to go. I take this to mean home detention at present can only be used if the sentence is less than 2 years. Judge Cost said this leads to distortive sentencing. He doesn't explain exactly what that means, but I take it to mean that there are some offenders who would benefit from home detention, but judges are not able to give that sentence because their sentences are longer than 2 years. He said in the United Kingdom there is a 4-year cut-off, so they can put people in home detention for 4 years, and Norway has no cut-off at all, so someone who has got a life sentence could serve it in home detention. Judge Cost says we should follow suit from the United Kingdom and Norway. There is another restriction on home detention. New Zealand, he says, does not have a residential option for people who have no home to go to. Now, if you send someone to home detention, with it they need to have a home that is able to receive them, a supportive relatives, a supportive whānau or local community. There are a very large number of people who do not have that kind of support. So those people, through no fault of their own, have no chance of being sent to home detention for lack of friends. He says this adds trouble to trouble they already have. They are isolated people. This isolation was probably part of what caused their crime, and now they cannot be given the most appropriate kind of punishment because of our law that does not allow home detention for them. He says also that Maori are overrepresented in our prison. They make up 15% of the overall population, but they make up 57% of the male prison population. He said this reflects the misdistribution of economic and educational poverty in this country, and it is a stain on our national character. Now, he doesn't say what the answer is to these Maori prison rates, but it suggests that the answer lies in the problem of poverty, not in something that could be solved by changing the prison system. So if we are addressing poverty, that would have the downstream effect of meaning fewer Maori and fewer others in prison. Now, I was very impressed by that whole article of his, and I recommend you read it if you haven't seen it already. But and I can't add a lot to them except to say that it's compassionate, and I think it's also realistic, and therefore something that we should get behind. Now, as to is it realistic? Well, how does New Zealand compare with other countries? I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it has a list showing the highest to the lowest countries as far as the proportion of their population in jail. The country with the highest proportion in jail is the United States. It has land of the free. It has 655 people in prison per 100,000 of population, or less than 1%. There is a similar figure for US territories such as American Virgin Islands, and there are also, to be added to that, juveniles in other forms of prison. North Korea is not listed on this table because it has not provided its figures, but they have been estimated by others at somewhere between 600 and 800 per 100,000 people. So in other words, they are either slightly better than the United States or slightly worse, but they're up in the same sort of area. Russia is 14th on the list with 411. South Africa comes 40th, 280. New Zealand is number 61 out of 222 countries. So we're 27% from the worst. We're in the top 27, if you like to put it, of the number of people in prison in New Zealand. Australia, that we think is harsh on prisoners, is considerably better than New Zealand, on 167. Tonga, several Pacific islands are around a similar figure to Australia. Tonga on 166, Fiji on 158. England and Wales are better than this on 141. China is surprisingly better than all of those on 118, though that is challenged by some people who say that there's a lot of their agricultural forced labour, the Laogai system, which would put them up around 170, still better than New Zealand. Norway has one of the lowest. Norway has 74, and it has home detention. So that's obviously the home detention, the fact they have home detention and the fact they've got low proportion in jail, obviously two sides of the same issue. Syria has 60, which is surprising. I'm not sure I believe that. Japan has 45, Iceland 38, which is rated one of the safest countries ahead of New Zealand. So they are safe and they have very few people in prison. India was 33, and Guinea-Bissau has the fewest people in prison, 10 per 100,000. Some of those figures are hotly contested in the discussion page on Wikipedia, especially China and Britain. A number of people think that their figures don't stack up. There are other aspects that don't show in those figures. But one of the reasons that we are in the highest bracket is obviously the high proportion of Maori men in jail. If that problem was solved, we would be somewhere near the bottom of the group rather than somewhere near the top. Our high proportion of prisoners may also reflect the fact that a high proportion of our population think we should get tougher on crime. Nothing to do with the criminals themselves, but to do with the voters. With our last election, National getting more votes than Labour, it's not surprising that we've had governments which want this kind of punitive justice system. So, and one example I should give of home detention, because it came up in the news only a week ago. In fact, it's still happening. A woman from Blenheim, Donella Knox, a few years ago was sentenced to 4 years jail for murdering her autistic daughter. She has now served 2 years of that sentence in jail, and she came up for parole last month. There were exceptional circumstances. Her daughter was increasingly violent. It was terribly difficult for her to control. She was in a lot of pain, but the doctors could not treat it for reasons that are not explained. And all this put the mother under huge stress. She was adding to her stress was she had no family or no support. She was not aware there was state support that she could have got help from. And so she didn't kill her brutally. She sedated her daughter with antipsychotic medicine and suffocated her and turned herself into the police. She got sentenced not to life imprisonment, but the judge at the time could see there were mitigating circumstances, but he still sentenced her to 4 years jail. And you have to ask, why was she sentenced to 4 years jail with those extenuating circumstances? And the answer is that we've got a law that says you cannot send someone to more than 2 years home detention. Well, she now, the parole board, is able to see things in a different light. It got a medical report on her and found that she was unlikely to commit any crime in future, no danger whatever to the general public. It recommended that she was still a bit flaky and should not be necessarily trusted looking after children or vulnerable people, but that should be at the discretion of the parole officer. So now this woman who has committed murder is as of this week, in effective home detention. And it's only the way that the law is framed that means it didn't happen 2 years earlier. So to me, that's a very clear example of the kind of issue that is at stake. This woman still has to be monitored, and maybe for another 2 years. But she's not regarded as being a risk to society. Where do we get this punitive approach to crime? I think the Christian religion has a lot to answer for it, including Jesus, who frequently told stories about God as a judge who sentences people to eternal punishment. But sometimes he toned that idea down. One example is the parable he told about the sheep and the goats. It's a parable of people being punished after their death. But there's a difference. The judge releases one group of people on the grounds that they visited people who are in prison. So although we've got a vicious judge, he is sympathetic with those who are in prison. Another quotation from Jesus is that he came to set the captives free. He was by no means the first Jew to have that goal. He was quoting the prophet Isaiah, who was writing in a time when the whole Jewish race was in exile, or not the whole of them, but quite a few, were in exile in Babylon. And he said that God wanted those people to be liberated. Other prophets also have argued that these people deserved to be in exile and should be punished, but Isaiah, for one, said punishment was excessive. The Bible has many stories of people who are in prison, almost all of them who are there unjustly. The patriarch Joseph, the Christian missionaries Peter and Paul, Jewish leaders under foreign governments like Daniel, and Jews in the Maccabean revolt against Greek rule. I was quite horrified to read the book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, a few weeks ago, and found that I looked up the word torture and found that there were dozens of times in the Bible the word torture is used. And many of these were in the revolt against Greek rule. They were put on the rack and their limbs were torn off. People were put in ovens to kill them. And this kind of torture still happens, especially in wartime. I was horrified in looking up the waterboard torture that the Americans used on political prisoners, and to find that both sides of the war used that in the Second World War, and that in preparation for D-Day, the British used this torture on many of their prisoners of war. So the punitiveness, in many cases, the treatment of prisoners is far worse than the crimes they're supposed to have committed. Now, we must admit that there are errors the other way. There are people who are freed on bail who go to commit more crimes. And we should say that there are some laws which are humane, and we should credit the governments that wrote them. I read earlier about Muhammad Ali being sentenced to jail for refusing to be drafted to the US Army. And he said that prison was a kind of slavery, so he was not scared of it. But he didn't actually end up in prison. He'd been sentenced, but his case went to appeal, and he was accepted as a conscientious objector. So there are humane things in what we might regard as the worst of countries. Another American in the news last month, Chelsea Manning, who was visited here, and she was jailed for leaking military secrets to Wikipedia in protest at the US military. But she was over here because she was given a pardon by President Obama, and although some countries still regard her as a persona non grata, New Zealand, for one, accepted her. So there are pieces of compassion in our modern legal systems. But my conclusion after looking at all this is that there are still too many people in prison in New Zealand, that we are in the worst 27% of countries in the world. It's not a black and white issue. I could not see any serious case that all prisons should be closed, but there's a very strong case that many people in prison should not be there. And there are many parts of the answer, and I'll list the ones that I've already mentioned. One of the answers is shorter jail terms. One of the answers is more money spent on policing, more use of home detention, open jails for people who are not danger, but not a danger to society, but don't have families who care for them. Psychological treatment, more energy and money spent on relieving poverty, more support on prisoners and their families personally. Rob mentioned the Prisoners' Aid and Rehabilitation Society, who care for prisoners. I was surprised once when I visited a gang headquarters to interview them that gangs are very supportive of their members who are in prison. So there are lots of things that can be done, and we should thank our politicians and judges as they struggle with these issues. They're looking for expert answers, but they will also be looking for public support, because the more public support these people get, the more humane they can be. Now, I invite you to join with me in a meditation, and if we just consider in silence, I'll suggest three kinds of people we should perhaps be thinking about. Let's first think of the victims of crime, people who have been raped, beaten up, whose goods have been stolen, who've been defrauded and their life sentences, life savings stolen from them. Let's think of people who have part of the management of people in jail, the police, the justice system, parole workers, prison psychologists. And let's think of the people in jail themselves, and their wives and husbands, and their partners and their children. Okay, for our closing blessing, may love inspire you, wisdom guide you, and peace surround you until we meet again.